There is a photograph that circulated in newspapers around the world in December of 1963, and to this day it is difficult to look at without feeling something tighten in your chest. In it, a 19-year-old boy is walking free down a quiet, expensive street in Bel Air, California, in the small hours before dawn. He has just been released by three men who snatched him from a hotel room at gunpoint, drove him around the state blindfolded in the trunk of a car, and held him for 2 days while his father, the most famous singer alive, scrambled from gas station to gas station with a bag of cash. The boy's name was Frank Sinatra Jr., and that terrifying ordeal, as strange as it sounds, may not even be the most surprising thing that happened to one of Frank Sinatra's 3 children. Because here is what most people never stop to consider. Frank Sinatra spent more than 6 decades as arguably the most recognized entertainer on the planet. Old Blue Eyes. The chairman of the board. A man whose voice defined the American century and whose private life filled more newspaper columns than almost anyone of his era. His face was on magazine covers before most of his children could read. His songs played in every bar and living room in the country, and when he died in 1998, the lights of the Empire State Building were dimmed, and the marquees of Las Vegas darkened in his honor. That was the scale of the man. That was the size of the shadow 3 ordinary children were born into and expected somehow to grow up underneath. And yet the 3 children he had with his first wife lived lives that most of the public knows almost nothing about. One of them became a genuine pop icon in her own right, only to spend her later years quietly guarding a legacy far larger than her own. One of them was kidnapped as a teenager, and then spent the rest of his life standing patiently in a shadow he could never quite step out of. And one of them walked away from the spotlight almost entirely, choosing instead to fight a long, bitter, and deeply personal battle over the soul of the family itself. Their names were Nancy, Frank Jr., and Tina, the 3 children of Frank Sinatra and Nancy Barbato. And what happened to each of them after the applause finally faded says more about what it actually costs to be born into that kind of fame than any of the countless documentaries about their father ever could. Let's start with the eldest, the daughter who did something almost none of the children of legends ever manage. She became famous entirely on her own terms. The daughter who became a star. Nancy Sandra Sinatra was born on the 8th of June 1940 in Jersey City, New Jersey, the first child of a young singer who was still clawing his way toward the fame that would eventually swallow the entire family whole. When Nancy arrived, her father was not yet the Frank Sinatra the world would come to know. He was a skinny kid from Hoboken with an extraordinary voice and a ferocious ambition, still years away from the Bobby Soxers screaming in the aisles and the movie roles and the Rat Pack nights in Las Vegas. Nancy was, by every account, the apple of his eye. So much so that he would later record a song called Nancy, with the laughing face, as a tribute to her, a tender little number that became a standard in his catalogue. But the fairy tale version of that childhood came apart the way so many things in this family eventually did. Frank's career exploded, and with it came the long absences, the endless touring, and eventually the affairs that dominated the tabloids. By 1951, when Nancy was 11, her parents divorced. Frank left to marry the actress Ava Gardner just 72 hours after the divorce was finalized. And Nancy's mother, also named Nancy, became the primary parent to all 3 children, raising them largely on her own while remaining, remarkably, on good terms with the man who had left. By most accounts, the elder Nancy Barbato never truly stopped loving Frank. She never remarried. She kept the Sinatra name for the rest of her long life, and she lived to the age of 101 before passing away in 2018. Growing up as Frank Sinatra's daughter meant growing up inside a strange kind of fishbowl, one where the ordinary business of being a teenager, the crushes and the arguments and the small embarrassments, all played out against the backdrop of one of the most watched families in America. And yet, Nancy did not shrink from it the way her siblings would. If anything, she seemed drawn toward the light. She studied music, dance, and voice. And when her father gave her a spot on one of his television specials, a Timex show in 1960 that also featured a young Elvis Presley freshly returned from the army, Nancy stepped in front of the cameras and stayed there. Her early recording career, though, went almost nowhere. For several years in the early 1960s, Nancy released single after single that failed to catch fire, And there were whispers around the industry that the only reason she had a contract at all was the last name printed on the record label. It is worth sitting with how difficult that must have been. Imagine trying to prove yourself in the one profession your father had already conquered more completely than almost anyone in history, and doing it while half the people in the room assume you are only there because of him. Then, in 1966, everything changed with a single song. Nancy had been paired with a songwriter and producer named Lee Hazelwood, a gravel-voiced maverick with a wholly different vision of what she could be. Where the studio had been trying to package her as a sweet, wholesome ingenue, Hazelwood reportedly told her to drop the good girl act entirely, to lower her voice, to sing like a woman who had lived a little, and had no interest in apologizing for it. It was, by most accounts, exactly the permission she had been waiting for. Together they recorded "These Boots Are Made for Walkin'." It became a worldwide #1 hit, a swaggering, defiant anthem that turned her almost overnight into a genuine pop star with an identity entirely her own. The song worked precisely because it did not sound like anything her father would ever record. It was cool where he was warm, hard where he was smooth, and unmistakably the product of a young woman stepping fully into her own moment. The go-go boots, the blonde hair, the cool detachment in her voice. None of it belonged to her father. It belonged to her. She followed it with a string of hits through the late 1960s, songs like Sugartown, Bang Bang, and Summer Wine. And she became one of the defining faces of that whole electric era of American pop. She also did something no American singer had ever done before. In 1967, she recorded the title theme for the James Bond film, You Only Live Twice, making her the first American ever to sing a Bond song, a distinction that still belongs to her more than half a century later. That same year, she and her father released a duet called Something Stupid, a soft, intimate little love song between two people that reached #1 and became, somewhat awkwardly, one of the only father-daughter duets ever to top the charts. Fans have joked about the strangeness of it for decades, but underneath the oddity there was something real. It was two people who genuinely loved each other, making music together at the peak of both their careers. Nancy's personal life during those years carried its own turbulence. In 1960, at just 20 years old, she married the teen idol and actor Tommy Sands. The marriage lasted about 5 years before ending in divorce, reportedly a painful one that left her shaken. Then in 1970, she married the choreographer Hugh Lambert, and that union proved to be the steady anchor her early adulthood had lacked. The two of them had 2 daughters together. Angela Jennifer, known to everyone as AJ, born in 1974, and Amanda, born in 1976. Nancy stepped back from the relentless pace of her recording career during those years to focus on raising them, choosing motherhood over the momentum of stardom at exactly the moment when many performers would have pushed harder for the spotlight. That marriage, though, ended in heartbreak of a different kind. Hugh Lambert was diagnosed with cancer, and Nancy nursed him through his illness until his death in 1985. She was widowed at 45, left to raise 2 teenage daughters largely on her own. A quiet echo, in some ways, of what her own mother had gone through decades earlier. What Nancy did in the years that followed surprised almost everyone. In 1995, at the age of 54, she posed for Playboy magazine, a decision that generated headlines precisely because it defied every expectation people had about how a woman her age, and a Sinatra no less, was supposed to behave. She has spoken about it since as a deliberate statement, a refusal to quietly disappear the way society so often expects older women to do. Whatever anyone made of it, it was unmistakably her own choice, made on her own terms, which is a phrase that describes almost everything about her life. Today, Nancy Sinatra is in her mid-80s, and she has settled into a role that suits her perhaps better than any other. She has become one of the most devoted keepers of her father's flame, overseeing reissues of his work, sharing memories and rare photographs with fans, and hosting radio programming dedicated to his music. At the same time, her own catalogue has found an entirely new audience. Her recordings from the 1960s have been rediscovered by younger generations, sampled by hip-hop artists, featured in films by directors like Quentin Tarantino, and reissued in lovingly assembled collections. Her 2 daughters have become deeply involved in that work. A. J. Lambert grew into a musician in her own right, performing jazz and pop and reinterpreting songs connected to her mother and grandfather, and more recently moving into directing. Amanda became an artist and photographer who has worked extensively on the family archives, helping to co-edit a limited edition book of rare Sinatra family photographs. There is something quietly moving about where Nancy has landed. She spent the first half of her life proving she was more than her father's daughter, and she succeeded, building a genuine and lasting career that stands entirely on its own. And then she spent the second half of her life choosing, freely and with obvious love, to devote herself to preserving his memory. Most people who knew that kind of fame young never find that balance. Nancy did. But as bright as Nancy's path was, her younger brother's story took a far darker and stranger turn, one that began on a snowy night in the mountains and would follow him, in one way or another, for the rest of his life. The son who lived in the shadow, Francis Wayne Sinatra, was born on the 10th of January 1944 in Jersey City, the only son and the middle child. From the moment he arrived, an almost impossible weight settled onto his small shoulders, because he was not just Frank Sinatra's son. He was Frank Sinatra's namesake, the boy expected, whether anyone said it out loud or not, to somehow carry forward the most famous voice in the world. And here is the cruel arithmetic of that inheritance. Frank Jr. did have real musical talent. He had a fine voice, a deep knowledge of music, and a genuine love of the craft. But he did not have, and could never have had, the once-in-a-century magic that made his father a phenomenon. No one could have. And so his entire life became a kind of unwinnable contest against a legend who happened to share his last name and his face. He grew up mostly with his mother and sisters after the divorce, seeing his father in the scattered, intense bursts that Frank's schedule allowed. By his late teens, Frank Jr. had decided, despite everything, to pursue singing himself. He began performing with a version of the Tommy Dorsey Orchestra, the very band that had helped launch his father's career 2 decades earlier, playing hotels and clubs, and slowly building the kind of modest working career that thousands of professional singers have. And then, on the night of the 8th of December, 1963, everything changed. Frank Jr. was 19 years old and booked to perform at Harrah's Club Lodge in Lake Tahoe, on the border between California and Nevada. A blizzard was raging outside. He was in his room 417, eating a chicken dinner with a friend, a trumpet player named John Foss, when there was a knock at the door. A man claimed to be delivering a package. When the door opened, 2 men forced their way in, bound and gagged Foss, blindfolded Frank Jr., threw an overcoat over his shoulders, and hustled him out a side door into the snow and into the trunk of a waiting Chevrolet Impala. The men who took him were not hardened professional criminals. They were, by most accounts, a ragtag group of amateurs. 2 of them, Barry Keenan and Joe Amsler, were 23-year-old former high school classmates from Los Angeles, and they were soon joined by a third man, John Irwin. Keenan, the ringleader, had convinced himself that a bold enough scheme could solve all of his financial problems, and he had settled on the audacious idea of kidnapping the son of one of the richest and most famous entertainers alive. For weeks they had reportedly been following the young singer from city to city, waiting for their moment. What followed was a tense, chaotic ordeal that gripped the entire country, coming as it did just weeks after the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, at a moment when America already felt like it was coming apart at the seams. Frank Jr. was driven south toward Los Angeles, held in a house, sometimes blindfolded, while the kidnappers made a series of phone calls to his desperate father. Frank Sinatra Sr. did exactly what almost any parent would do. He cooperated completely. He told reporters, in a line that has echoed ever since, that he would give the entire world for his son. He even offered the kidnappers $1 million, though in a strange twist they insisted on their original demand of $240,000, apparently unwilling to deviate from their own plan. The ransom was paid in the early morning hours of December 11th, dropped off between 2 parked school buses at a gas station, per the kidnappers' precise instructions. And then, in the end, it was the kidnappers' own nerves that unraveled the scheme. One of them, growing anxious, let Frank Jr. go free before the others even returned with the money. The young man was found walking, unharmed, through an exclusive Bel Air neighborhood by a private security guard around 3 in the morning. Within days, all 3 kidnappers were arrested, and nearly all of the ransom money was recovered. And here is where the story took the turn that may have wounded Frank Jr. most deeply of all. At the trial, the kidnapper's defense attorney floated a poisonous theory, suggesting that the whole thing had been a publicity stunt, that Frank Jr. had arranged his own kidnapping to boost his fledgling singing career. It was not true. The Sinatra family denied it vehemently, and the men were convicted, with the ringleaders receiving long sentences, though all 3 would ultimately be released within about 5 years. But the damage was done. For years afterward, a cruel cloud of suspicion hung over the young singer, a whispered insinuation that the most traumatic experience of his life had been some kind of stunt. Imagine surviving something that terrifying and then having to watch a portion of the public treat it as a joke. Sit with that for a moment, because it is one of the crueler ironies in this entire family's history. A young man is snatched at gunpoint, thrown in the trunk of a car, and held for 2 days in genuine fear for his life. He survives it. And then, instead of receiving the sympathy that any victim of a violent crime deserves, he has to spend years listening to strangers whisper that he must have made the whole thing up to sell a few more records. There is almost no way to defend yourself against an accusation like that. The more you insist it was real, the more the cynics nod knowingly, as if your protest were proof. It was, in its own quiet way, a second kind of theft, one that took not his freedom but his dignity, and it dragged on far longer than the 54 hours of the actual ordeal. Frank Jr. almost never spoke publicly about the kidnapping for the rest of his life. He simply refused to discuss it in any depth, apparently determined not to let those 2 days define him. On the rare occasions he was asked about it directly, he tended to shut the conversation down quickly and move on. But it is hard to imagine an experience like that not leaving a permanent mark on a 19-year-old, and those close to him have suggested it made him even more guarded, even more private, than he might otherwise have been. Some who followed his career have wondered whether that trauma, buried and unspoken, is part of what gave his adult persona its famous reserve, the sense of a man holding something carefully in check at all times. What he did instead was work. For decades, Frank Jr. built a steady, unglamorous career as a singer, and increasingly as a conductor and arranger of real skill. And then, in 1988, he took on the role that would come to define the rest of his life. His father hired him as his musical director and conductor. For the final decade of Frank Sinatra Sr.'s performing career, it was his son standing at the podium, baton in hand, leading the orchestra behind the legend, making sure every arrangement was perfect, every tempo exactly right for an aging voice that needed careful support. Think about what that role actually meant. Every single night, Frank Jr. stood a few feet from his father, helping to hold up the very legend that had overshadowed his entire life, pouring his considerable musical talent into service of the one voice he could never surpass. He knew the arrangements better than anyone. He knew which keys his father's aging voice could still reach, and which ones to quietly transpose. He knew when to let the orchestra swell and when to pull it back to a whisper so the old man could find the note. It was, in a sense, the ultimate act of a son taking care of a father, dressed up in the formal language of a musical director and his star. Some people saw it as a kind of tragedy. The son reduced to a supporting player in his father's show, the namesake permanently relegated to the podium, while the real Frank Sinatra stood in the spotlight. But by many accounts, Frank Jr. saw it very differently. It gave him something he had wanted his whole life: real, sustained, professional closeness with his father, a chance to be genuinely needed by him night after night, in a way that the scattered visits of his childhood had never allowed. For a boy who had grown up experiencing his father mostly as a distant, dazzling figure, standing beside him on stage for a decade may have been the closest thing to the relationship he had always longed for. In those years leading the band, he was not competing with the legend anymore. He was helping to sustain it, and by every indication there was a kind of hard-won peace in that. He had stopped trying to be Frank Sinatra, and had found instead a way to be indispensable to him. After his father's death in 1998, Frank Jr. carried the music forward on his own, touring with programs dedicated to the Sinatra songbook, keeping the arrangements alive, introducing new audiences to the material he knew better than almost anyone living. He even developed an unexpected second life in popular culture, lending his voice to animated shows and popping up in the occasional acting role. He had a son of his own, Michael, and though his personal life remained largely out of the public eye, the through line of his adult years was clear. He devoted himself almost entirely to the preservation and performance of the music his father had made immortal. On the 16th of March 2016, Frank Sinatra Jr. died suddenly of cardiac arrest in Daytona Beach, Florida, while on tour, still doing the work he had done his whole life. He was 72 years old. He passed away, fittingly and heartbreakingly, on the road in the middle of a concert engagement, singing the songs that had shaped his entire existence. The tributes that poured in afterward finally gave him something the public had too often denied him while he was alive: a recognition of his real musicianship, his deep knowledge, and his lifetime of quiet, dignified labor in service of a legacy that was never quite allowed to be his own. If Nancy found the light, and Frank Jr. made his peace with the shadow, the third and youngest child took a path different from both of them. She chose, for the most part, to step out of the frame entirely. But that did not mean she stepped away from the fight. Because when the family's most painful battle finally came, it was Tina who stood at the very center of it. The daughter who fought for the family. Christina Sinatra, known to everyone as Tina, was born on the 20th of June 1948, the youngest of the three, and in some ways the one shaped most by absence. She was only 3 years old when her parents divorced, too young to remember much of the household as an intact family. Her earliest memories of her father were, by her own later accounts, memories of a visitor, a dazzling, larger-than-life figure who would sweep in and then sweep out again, leaving behind a home run entirely by her mother. Where Nancy had known her father in his hungry, striving early years, and Frank Jr. had known him as the reigning legend, Tina largely knew him as a kind of beautiful absence, a man she spent much of her life trying to get closer to. Unlike her older siblings, Tina showed little interest in performing. She did not want to sing, and she did not want to stand in front of cameras. Instead, she gravitated toward the business side of the entertainment world, the part that happens behind the scenes, out of the light. She worked as a producer, and over the years she became the family member most directly involved in managing and protecting her father's professional interests and, eventually, his legacy. It was a role that suited her temperament, someone who preferred to be the person making sure things were done right rather than the person being watched. Her personal life moved through several chapters. In 1970, she became engaged to the actor Robert Wagner, though the relationship ended before they married. She married the musician and songwriter Wes Farrell in 1974 in a ceremony held at her father's apartment at Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas, though that marriage ended in divorce within a few years. She married again briefly in the early 1980s. Through it all, she remained childless, and she has spoken with a kind of clear-eyed honesty about the choices that shaped her life, choices that kept her, by design, further from the public eye than either of her siblings. Tina's defining professional achievement came in 1992 when she served as the executive producer of Sinatra, a 5-hour television miniseries about her father's life that aired on CBS. It was a labor of love and control in equal measure, an attempt to tell the family's story on the family's own terms, and it was both a critical and popular success, watched by an enormous audience and earning a shelf of nominations. For Tina, it represented something more than a production credit. It was a way of shaping the narrative of who her father was, of ensuring that the version of the story reaching millions of people was one the family itself had helped to build. In a life defined by the fact that everyone in the world seemed to have an opinion about her father, the miniseries was Tina's attempt to plant a flag, to say that his own children, the people who had actually lived alongside him, deserved a hand in how the legend was told. It also gave her a taste of something she would spend years pursuing in one form or another, a measure of control over a story that had always felt like it belonged to the public more than to the family. But the chapter of Tina's life that generated the most attention, and the most pain, revolved around her father's fourth and final wife, Barbara Marx. Frank Sinatra married Barbara in 1976, and from the beginning, by Tina's later account, a wedge began to form between the aging singer and the children of his first marriage. In her memoir, published in 2000 and titled my father's daughter. Tina wrote with unflinching candor about what she saw as a deliberate campaign to isolate her father, to separate him from his children and his oldest friends, and to gain control over his affairs and his estate. She described a beloved father growing more remote and more isolated in his final years, and she wrote about painful, technical, deeply personal disputes over things like how the family's assets were held and who would ultimately control what Frank Sinatra left behind. It is worth pausing here, because this is the part of the Sinatra family story that most people never hear. The public image is all glamour and swagger and Rat Pack cool, tuxedos and cocktails and effortless charm. But behind that image was a family. And like so many families with wealth and fame and complicated histories, it fractured over the questions that fracture ordinary families too. Questions of money, of access, of who gets to be close to a dying parent, and of who gets to decide what happens after he is gone. Strip away the famous name and the enormous fortune, and what you are left with is a story that plays out in ordinary households across the world every single day. A parent remarries late in life. The new spouse and the grown children view each other with suspicion. Old loyalties collide with new ones. And when the parent begins to decline, all of that unspoken tension rises to the surface at precisely the moment when everyone involved is least equipped to handle it with grace. The only difference in the Sinatra case was the scale, and the fact that so much of it eventually spilled into public view. Tina's memoir presented a very different picture of her father's final marriage than the one Barbara herself would later offer in her own book, and the two accounts stand in stark, irreconcilable contrast to this day. There is no neutral, agreed-upon version of what really happened inside that household in those years. There are only the competing memories of people who each loved Frank Sinatra in their own way and each believed they were protecting him. What comes through most powerfully in Tina's own telling, though, is not bitterness so much as grief. Her father's final years were shadowed by declining health and, eventually, by dementia. And what she seems to mourn most is not any specific dispute over property, but the sense that she was being kept from her father precisely when she wanted to be closest to him, that the man who had been a beautiful absence throughout her childhood was slipping away again at the very end, this time for good. When she writes about his death in 1998 and about his funeral, the tone shifts entirely into something tender and raw and unmistakably loving. Whatever battles she fought them, in her own understanding, out of devotion. In the years since, Tina has largely done what she always seemed to want to do. She has stepped back out of the light. She lives quietly in Los Angeles, remaining involved in the stewardship of her father's legacy from a comfortable distance, giving the occasional interview but mostly declining the endless opportunities her last name could have provided. Of the 3 children, she is the one who most fully chose privacy, and she has held to that choice with remarkable consistency. She said what she had to say in her memoir, and then she went quiet, apparently content to let her version of the story simply exist on the record rather than continuing to relitigate it in public. There is a striking symmetry to the 3 of them when you lay their lives side by side. One embraced the spotlight and built her own fame within it. One made his uneasy peace with living inside his father's shadow. And one stepped almost entirely out of the frame, surfacing only to fight for what she believed her family's legacy should be. 3 siblings, 1 impossible last name, and 3 completely different answers to the same impossible question. What do you do with a father that famous? Where they stand today, more than a quarter of a century after Frank Sinatra's death in May of 1998, and more than 70 years since the divorce that first scattered this family, the surviving children remain bound together by the extraordinary and complicated inheritance they share. Nancy Sinatra, now in her mid-80s, continues to be the most publicly present of the 3. She remains active in preserving and celebrating her father's music, overseeing reissues and sharing his memory with a devotion that has only deepened with age, while her own body of work enjoys a genuine and ongoing revival among audiences too young to have been alive when These Boots Are Made for Walkin' first climbed the charts. Her 2 daughters, A.J. Grasson and Amanda, have carried the family's creative and archival work forward into a new generation, one through music and film, the other through art and photography, keeping both their mother's legacy and their grandfather's very much alive. Frank Sinatra Jr. is gone now, having died in 2016 while still doing the work he devoted his life to, but the shape of his legacy has only grown clearer in the years since. He is remembered now less as the boy in the kidnapping headlines and more as what he actually was, a serious, gifted musician who spent decades as one of the most knowledgeable and dedicated stewards of the American songbook, a man who stood at his father's side for the final chapter of that legendary career and helped hold it aloft, night after night, out of what can only be described as love. His son, Michael, carries the family name forward. Tina Sinatra, now in her 70s, lives the quiet life she seems always to have wanted, out of the public eye in Los Angeles, still connected to the careful management of her father's legacy, still declining most of the attention her name could command. Having said her piece in the pages of her memoir, she has largely fallen silent, content to let her account of the family's most painful years stand on its own. Between them, the three children gave Frank Sinatra a small handful of grandchildren, several of whom have taken up the work of keeping his memory active. Through his music, through the archives, through the ongoing stewardship of a body of work that shows no sign of fading from the culture, the Sinatra name still means something enormous. But the people who carry it have, for the most part, chosen to carry it quietly. What their story leaves behind. When you look back at old footage of Frank Sinatra, the tuxedo, the tilted hat, the effortless swagger under the stage lights, it is tempting to imagine that everyone in his orbit lived at that same glamorous altitude. But somewhere behind that image, three children were growing up in a home run by their mother, navigating a father who was adored by the entire world, and physically present for only fragments of their lives. And each of them, in their own time and in their own way, had to work out exactly how much of that overwhelming inheritance they wanted to carry forward and how much they needed to set down in order to become themselves. Nancy carried it forward and made something new out of it, proving she was an artist in her own right before devoting herself to honoring the man who came before her. Frank Jr. carried it as faithfully as anyone possibly could, giving his whole professional life to the music his father made immortal, and finding, in the end, a kind of quiet dignity in that service. And Tina carried it into the one place the others would not go, into the painful, private battles over what the family truly was and who had the right to define it, fighting for a version of her father she believed the world deserved to remember. There is a lesson buried in all of this, and it has very little to do with fame. It is about what children do with the weight their parents hand them, whether that weight is a famous name or something quieter and more ordinary. Some polish it and hold it up to the light. Some carry it in silence. Some fight over exactly what it is supposed to mean. The Sinatra children did all three, and the fact that they each found such different answers is, in its own way, the most human thing about them. Frank Sinatra spent his life in front of more cameras and more adoring crowds than almost anyone in the history of American entertainment. His three children spent their lives, each in their own fashion, figuring out how to live in the enormous space his shadow cast. That they managed to become distinct, complicated, fully realized people at all, rather than mere footnotes to a legend, might be the truest measure of who they were. And given everything they each lived through to get there, it is hard not to see that as a legacy every bit as meaningful as the one their father left behind. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.